Picture a phone screen at 2 in the morning. A video autoplays. Rubble, a chant, a flag on fire. Somebody shares it, somebody else shares it, and within an hour, it has traveled further than most journalism ever will. That's the version of Palestinian society most of the world consumes, a single loud frame ripped out of a much longer story. Propaganda doesn't lie by inventing things out of thin air, it lies by cropping. It shows you the frame that confirms what you already believe and it cuts everything around it. Today, we're putting the frame back. Not to erase the horror that's real and not to excuse anyone, but to show you the parts of this picture both sides would rather you never saw. Start in Gaza on a hot afternoon in July of 2023. Imagine a narrow street in Khan Yunis packed wall to wall with people who have nothing left to lose. A man named Shadi Abu Kuda was buried alive as a bulldozer flattened his home, a document proving he owned the land still in his hand. Within days, thousands were in the streets, not shouting about Israel, but about the government running their own lives. They burned tires. In some places, they burned Hamas flags. The chant was simple: "We want to live." This wasn't the first time. Back in 2019, a youth movement called We Want to Live rose up over unemployment, taxes, and a government that couldn't keep the lights on, and Hamas security forces responded by rounding up more than 1,000 people in a matter of weeks. Fast forward to the spring of 2025, well into the war, and the streets of Beit Lahia filled again, this time with people chanting for Hamas to simply leave, to let them live in freedom, blaming the group's continued rule for prolonging a war that had already buried tens of thousands of their neighbors. None of this made most Western headlines for long. It's inconvenient for a simple story. Polling from the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research found Hamas's support inside Gaza sitting at roughly a third of the population, rising and falling with the war itself. A third, not the total loyalty Hamas's own propaganda wants you to believe exists, and not the complete rejection some Israeli commentary wants you to believe either. Somewhere in that gap between the two extremes is where most actual Gazans live, exhausted, critical, and largely unheard. Now picture a different kind of room, not a protest, a living room somewhere outside Tel Aviv, where a woman named Miri lights a candle every year for a brother she lost in 1973. Across the country, in a village near Hebron, a man named Mohammed does the same for people he's lost to this same endless conflict. They've never met by accident, they met on purpose through an organization called the Parent Circle Families Forum. Hundreds of Israeli and Palestinian families bound by the one thing no one would choose to have in common: they've each buried someone to this war. Instead of turning that grief into another reason for revenge, they sit in the same room and talk. Some of them have lost sons since October 7th, 2023, and even now they keep showing up to those meetings. Alongside them, a group called Combatants for Peace was founded by former fighters, Israeli and Palestinian, who once carried weapons against each other and have since laid them down for something else entirely. Women Wage Peace on the Israeli side, and its sister movement, Women of the Sun on the Palestinian side, organize marches and joint actions across a line most people assume can never be crossed. None of this cancels out anyone's pain. It doesn't erase a single funeral. What it proves is something simpler and maybe more important. Grief doesn't automatically turn into hatred. For some people living through the worst of this, it turns into the opposite. Here's a scene most cameras never bother to film. Two doctors scrubbing in together before surgery, one Israeli, one Palestinian, inside Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. Disease doesn't check a patient's passport before it starts spreading, and neither do these hospitals. In the years before the current war, tens of thousands of Palestinian patients crossed into Israel every year for cancer treatment, heart surgery, dialysis, care coordinated through medical partnerships that have quietly existed since the 1990s. Picture a checkpoint at dawn, a Palestinian volunteer driver handing off a sick child to an Israeli volunteer driver on the other side, a human relay chain built out of nothing but trust between two strangers who will probably never learn each other's last name. And before the war shut most of it down, well over 100,000 Palestinian workers crossed daily into Israeli towns and cities, building homes, picking crops, running machines, forming an economic lifeline that both governments quietly relied on, and neither one likes to advertise, because it complicates the clean story each side prefers to tell about the other. Now for the part propaganda inside Gaza works hardest to bury. Picture a journalist in Gaza City, camera raised at a protest, when security officers in plain clothes wade into the crowd. Human Rights Watch documented this pattern in a report bluntly titled Zero Dissent, describing arbitrary arrests and the torture of peaceful critics carried out by Hamas's own security forces, including the beating of journalists and the confiscation of their cameras for the crime of simply filming. Amnesty International has recorded Hamas forces detaining human rights workers investigating those very abuses. The US State Department has reported that under Hamas, Gaza has effectively had no free press at all, with reporters harassed, detained, or assaulted for stories the authorities didn't want told. This isn't an Israeli talking point smuggled into the conversation. It's the same human rights organizations that spend just as much time documenting Israeli abuses, turning that same unflinching lens on Hamas, and finding a government that treats its own people's criticism as a threat to be crushed. So why does almost none of this reach you? Picture the algorithm itself as a bored, distracted crowd, scrolling fast, rewarding whatever makes it stop for half a second longer. A video of a joint Israeli-Palestinian peace march earns a fraction of the views of a video showing an atrocity. Extremists on every side of this conflict understand that instinctively, and they flood every platform with the most inflammatory footage available, because outrage is the currency that keeps people watching. A doctor scrubbing in beside a colleague doesn't perform well in 15 seconds. A grieving mother choosing dialogue over vengeance doesn't perform well either. So the platforms bury them under the algorithm's own indifference, and propaganda outlets on every side are more than happy to let them stay buried because a complicated Palestinian doesn't serve anyone's narrative. None of what you just heard is meant to erase what's real. Hamas carried out a massacre on October 7th, 2023, and continues to hold hostages taken that day. Palestinian civilians in Gaza have died in staggering documented numbers since. Both of those facts remain absolutely true, and nothing in the last few minutes cancels either one out. Understanding complexity is not the same thing as excusing terrorism, and it's not the same thing as ignoring suffering either. It simply means refusing to let a 15-second clip finish a thought that actually took decades to build. So the next time a video promises to show you exactly who these people really are in 20 seconds, in one color wrapped around one slogan, stop for a second before you share it. Ask yourself who benefits from you believing the simple version. Look for the people who refuse to fit the story. That's not weakness, and it's not naivety. It's the only way anyone has ever actually understood a conflict like this one. If this kind of nuance is worth more of your time than the next viral clip, subscribe and think twice before that clip does your thinking for you.